I trained my replacement without knowing I was being laid off the following week. The email arrived at 3:14 p.m. on a Thursday, marked urgent from HR. I was sitting in the conference room with Nathan Briggs, walking him through the intricacies of our proprietary database system for the third time that week. He was asking detailed questions about administrative access, backup protocols, and client contact lists, stuff that seemed overly thorough for a supposed lateral transfer from the Boston office. I remember thinking he was just being diligent. My phone buzzed. The subject line read, "Meeting request, Friday 9 a.m., confidential." The sender was Veronica Huang from Human Resources, and copied was my direct supervisor, Mitchell. Wait, I need to check my forbidden names list. Let me restart that. The sender was Veronica Huang from Human Resources, and copied was my direct supervisor, Gregory Ashford, plus someone named Philip Constantine from Legal. My stomach dropped for reasons I couldn't articulate yet. Nathan noticed my face change and asked if everything was okay. I told him it was fine, and went back to explaining the client retention reports he'd need to run quarterly, wondering why legal would be involved in what should have been a routine HR meeting. I'd been with Titan Solutions for 9 years, starting as a junior analyst and working my way up to senior client success manager. I managed a portfolio worth roughly $8.3 million in annual recurring revenue across 32 enterprise accounts. My retention rate was 94%, the highest in the company's history, and I'd personally brought in 6 of our 10 largest clients through referrals and relationship building. The company culture was intense but rewarding. Long hours, high stakes, but they recognized talent and rewarded loyalty. At least I thought they did. Gregory had called me into his office 3 weeks earlier with what he described as an exciting opportunity. We were expanding our East Coast operations and needed someone from the original team to mentor new hires who'd be supporting our growing client base. Nathan was the first, a supposed transfer from our satellite office, who needed to understand how we operated at headquarters. I was honored. Gregory said he trusted me to represent the company's values and operational excellence. He said Nathan would shadow me for 4 to 6 weeks, learn our systems, then return to Boston to implement similar processes there. It made sense. I never questioned it. Nathan started following me everywhere. Morning stand-up meetings, client calls, strategy sessions with the product team. He took notes constantly, asked to record our conversations for training purposes, requested copies of every template, script, and workflow document I'd created over the years. I gave him everything. Why wouldn't I? We were on the same team. He sat in on my weekly check-ins with Gregory, observed how I handled difficult client conversations, learned the personal details I'd memorized about each account executive's preferences and communication styles. I introduced him to clients as a colleague who'd be supporting their accounts during high-volume periods. Some clients seemed confused about why someone from Boston would be involved with their West Coast-focused contracts, but I smoothed it over, assured them Nathan was just learning our processes to maintain consistency across offices. One client, the CFO at Meridian Dynamics, actually asked me directly if I was leaving. I laughed it off, told her I'd been with Titan for nearly a decade and had no plans to go anywhere. She seemed relieved, but still looked uncertain when I ended the call. The signs were everywhere, and I missed every single one. 2 weeks into Nathan's training, I was excluded from a company-wide strategy meeting for the first time in 4 years. Gregory said they were discussing Boston expansion specifically, and it wasn't relevant to my current portfolio. I accepted this explanation even though my portfolio included 3 Boston-based clients. Then I noticed my calendar invitations for monthly leadership reviews had stopped. I'd been part of that group since my promotion to senior manager 18 months earlier. When I asked Gregory about it, he said they were restructuring the meeting format and would loop me back in once they finalized the new approach. I told myself this made sense, that growing companies constantly evolve their processes. That same week, I was asked to document every aspect of my role, ostensibly for a company handbook they were creating. I spent 12 hours writing detailed guides on client onboarding, escalation procedures, renewal negotiations, relationship maintenance strategies, even the informal coffee chat approach I used to build rapport with new stakeholders. I outlined my entire professional methodology, gift-wrapped my accumulated knowledge, and handed it over without a second thought. Nathan's questions became more specific and strategic. He wanted to know which clients were most likely to churn, which accounts had the highest expansion potential, which executives at each company held budget authority for our services. He asked about my commission structure, my salary band, my performance bonus calculations. I thought he was curious about compensation differences between offices, maybe trying to negotiate better terms for his own transfer. I answered honestly, because transparency was supposedly one of our core values. He asked about my relationship with Gregory, whether we ever disagreed on strategy, how I handled conflict with leadership. I told him Gregory and I had a strong working relationship built on mutual respect and open communication, that we rarely disagreed because we both prioritized client outcomes above ego. Nathan nodded and typed something into his phone. I didn't think about what he might be reporting or to whom. I was training my replacement and calling it mentorship, building the case for my own obsolescence and calling it teamwork. The Friday meeting invite haunted me all evening. I tried calling Gregory twice, but both calls went to voicemail. I sent him a text asking if everything was okay, if there was anything I should prepare for the morning meeting. He responded 3 hours later with a thumbs-up emoji. Nothing else. I barely slept. My wife Diane asked if something was wrong at work. I told her about the meeting, about the weird feeling I'd had all week, about Nathan's increasingly pointed questions. She suggested I was being paranoid, that HR probably just wanted to discuss Nathan's progress or get feedback on the training program. Her logical explanation should have calmed me, but my gut knew something was wrong. I spent most of the night staring at LinkedIn, looking at Nathan's profile, trying to understand why a supposed lateral transfer from Boston had a background that mirrored mine almost exactly. Same degree, similar work history, comparable tenure in client success roles. He wasn't a mentee, he was a replacement, and I'd spent 3 weeks giving him everything he needed to step into my role seamlessly. I arrived at the office at 8:30 a.m., 30 minutes early for my 9 a.m. meeting. The reception area felt different, quieter somehow, like the building itself knew what was coming. I went to my desk and tried to focus on email, but my hands were shaking too badly to type. Nathan arrived at 8:45, gave me a slight smile and a nod, then headed toward Gregory's office without his usual morning greeting. I watched him disappear down the hallway and felt my chest tighten. At 8:57, Veronica appeared at my desk with a cardboard box and a sympathetic expression that confirmed my worst fears. She asked me to follow her to conference room C, the windowless interior room we used for confidential discussions. The box was for my personal belongings. I knew before she said a single word that I was done. My 9-year career at Titan Solutions was ending in a beige conference room with a HR representative I'd spoken to maybe 3 times, about to deliver news that would financially devastate my family while I processed the betrayal of spending 3 weeks training the person who would erase me from the organization I'd helped build. Veronica sat across from me with a folder containing documents I'd soon learn were a separation agreement and a non-disclosure clause designed to silence me in exchange for 8 weeks of severance. Philip Constantine from legal sat beside her, a man in his mid-50s with steel-gray hair and an expression that suggested he'd done this hundreds of times. He didn't introduce himself, just opened his laptop and began typing notes on our conversation before it even started. Veronica spoke in the rehearsed tone of someone reading from a script, explaining that Titan Solutions was restructuring its client success division to improve operational efficiency and reduce redundancy across regional offices. My role was being consolidated with Nathan's position as part of a broader initiative to streamline headcount while maintaining service quality. She used the word consolidated like it was less brutal than eliminated, like changing the terminology would somehow soften the reality that I was being fired after nearly a decade of exemplary performance. She slid the separation agreement across the table and gave me 24 hours to review and sign it. Philip finally spoke, his voice carrying the practiced warning that discussing the terms of my departure with current employees would constitute breach of contract and result in forfeiture of my severance package. I was being paid to disappear quietly. I asked the obvious question, the one burning in my throat since I sat down. Why Nathan? Why now? What had I done wrong? Veronica's expression softened slightly, and for a moment, I thought I saw actual human sympathy beneath the corporate facade. She explained that my performance wasn't the issue, that my numbers were strong, that this wasn't about individual capability, but rather organizational restructuring and cost optimization. Philip shot her a warning look, and she immediately stopped elaborating. I understood what she wasn't saying. Nathan was younger, cheaper, probably made about 60% of my $110,000 salary plus commission. He didn't have my tenure, my accrued vacation time, my vested stock options. I'd spent 3 weeks teaching him everything I knew so the company could fire me and save roughly $45,000 annually while maintaining the same client service level. It was brilliant and sociopathic in equal measure. I asked if Gregory knew, if he'd been part of this decision. Veronica and Philip exchanged glances. Philip answered that leadership decisions were made collaboratively across multiple departments and that my direct supervisor had been consulted throughout the process. Gregory had known. He'd looked me in the eye for 3 weeks while I trained my replacement, shared coffee and small talk, asked about my daughter's soccer games, and knew the entire time that he was orchestrating my termination. I wanted to rage, to flip the table, to demand they explain how this was legal or ethical or remotely justifiable. Instead, I asked about the transition timeline. Veronica seemed relieved by my professional composure, probably expected me to make a scene. She explained that today would be my last day, that I should pack my personal belongings and return my laptop, security badge, and company phone before leaving the building. Nathan would assume my accounts beginning Monday morning. Clients would receive a brief email introduction explaining that I'd moved on to pursue other opportunities and that Nathan would be their new primary contact. My transition would be framed as a voluntary departure, my firing disguised as a career change to protect the company's reputation and client relationships. They'd already drafted the email. Veronica showed me the template on her laptop. It was warm and gracious, thanking me for my contributions and wishing me well in my future endeavors. It was signed with Gregory's name. I'd spent 3 weeks training Nathan to fill my role, and they'd spent those same 3 weeks writing my professional obituary and planning my silent exit. Philip pushed the separation agreement toward me again and walked through the key terms using language designed to intimidate and confuse. In exchange for 8 weeks of salary continuation, I would agree not to disparage Titan Solutions publicly or privately, not to solicit current clients for competing services, not to disclose the terms of my departure to anyone except my spouse and attorney, and not to pursue legal action against the company for any reason related to my employment or termination. The severance was contingent on signing a comprehensive release of claims, essentially waiving my right to sue for wrongful termination, age discrimination, or any other potential violation. I asked if I could take the agreement to an employment attorney before signing. Philip's expression didn't change, but his tone became noticeably colder. He said I could consult an attorney if I wished, but the offer would expire in 24 hours regardless of whether I'd obtained legal counsel. The implication was clear: sign quickly and take the money, or refuse and get nothing. I had a mortgage, a car payment, and a daughter starting high school in the fall. 8 weeks of salary wasn't generous, but it was better than zero. They knew I couldn't afford to refuse. I asked to speak with Gregory. Veronica said that wouldn't be possible, that he was in meetings all day and had delegated the separation process to HR and legal. I insisted. I'd worked directly under Gregory for 6 years, had helped him build this division from 12 clients to 32, had covered for him during his divorce when he needed to leave early for custody hearings, had driven him to the emergency room when he had a kidney stone during an off-site retreat. I'd earned the right to hear this from him directly, to understand why he couldn't even face me while dismantling my career. Philip told me that insisting on contact with former supervisors would be viewed as harassment and could jeopardize my severance eligibility. Veronica placed her hand on the table between us, a gesture that might have been meant as comforting, but felt patronizing. She said Gregory specifically requested that she handle this conversation because he knew it would be difficult for both of us, that he thought a clean break would be easier. The truth was, Gregory was a coward who couldn't look at the person he'd betrayed while executing corporate cost-cutting masquerading as strategic restructuring. I signed the agreement, not because I agreed with it, but because I needed time to think, to consult an actual attorney, to figure out if there was any recourse beyond quietly accepting my professional execution. Veronica seemed surprised by my immediate compliance, probably expected me to negotiate or at least read the full document before signing. I didn't care about the specific terms in that moment. I just wanted out of that conference room, away from their manufactured sympathy and legal intimidation. Philip collected the signed documents, slid them into his folder, and stood to leave without another word. Veronica walked me back to my desk, where the cardboard box sat waiting like a coffin for my professional life. 9 years condensed into one medium-sized box, a few framed photos, a coffee mug my daughter made in pottery class, some awards and certificates I'd earned, a small plant Diane gave me when I got promoted, the physical artifacts of a career that ended because I was too expensive to keep and too trusting to see it coming. Nathan walked past while I was packing. He didn't make eye contact, just kept moving toward the conference room where he'd probably spend the afternoon learning the final details of the accounts he'd inherit from me Monday morning. I finished packing around 10:30 a.m. and carried my box past the cubicles where my former colleagues pretended not to notice what was happening. A few people looked up with expressions ranging from sympathy to relief that it wasn't them being walked out. Nobody said anything. That's what happens when people witness a firing. They avert their eyes and protect themselves by pretending they didn't see the company's capacity for casual cruelty. I surrendered my laptop and phone to IT, a younger guy named Kevin who'd asked me for career advice 6 months earlier. He processed my equipment return without meeting my eyes, probably worried that acknowledging our previous friendship might somehow implicate him in my termination. I handed over my security badge at reception, and the administrative assistant who'd greeted me every morning for 9 years mumbled something about hoping I'd land somewhere good. I walked to my car carrying a cardboard box that weighed almost nothing but felt impossibly heavy, drove out of the parking lot I'd pulled into thousands of times, and realized I'd just been erased from a company I'd helped build by the same people who'd spent weeks pretending to value my expertise while systematically stealing it. I drove to a coffee shop 3 miles from the office and sat in my car for 20 minutes before going inside. I needed to think, to process what had just happened, to figure out how I'd tell Diane that I'd lost my job in the most humiliating way possible. I'd trained my own replacement like an obedient employee, documented my entire professional knowledge base, introduced my clients to the person who would replace me, and thanked Gregory for the opportunity to mentor emerging talent. I'd been so proud of my commitment to the company's growth that I'd facilitated my own termination without realizing what I was doing. The coffee shop was nearly empty, just a few people working on laptops and a barista who looked barely old enough to vote. I ordered black coffee and found a table in the corner where I could sit with my back to the wall and my failure in full view. I pulled out my phone and started Googling employment attorneys in the area. The first 3 websites all mentioned wrongful termination as a specialty area, along with age discrimination, retaliation, and hostile work environment claims. I didn't know which category my situation fell into, if any. All I knew was that something about how Titan Solutions handled my termination felt illegal, even if I couldn't articulate exactly what law they'd broken. I called an attorney named Dorothy Faulkner, whose website emphasized employment law and worker protection. Her receptionist said she could meet with me that afternoon if I could come to her office in Oakmont by 2 p.m. I confirmed and spent the next 2 hours researching California employment law, trying to understand if Titan Solutions had violated any statutes by having me train my replacement before notifying me of my impending termination. The legal language was dense and confusing, but I found several articles about employers who'd been successfully sued for using deceptive training programs to extract knowledge from employees before firing them. One case involved a software company that had paid a $1.2 million settlement to a senior developer who'd been told to document his code for a supposed audit, only to be terminated immediately after completing the documentation. The similarities to my situation were striking. I'd spent 3 weeks creating detailed guides, introducing Nathan to my clients, explaining my methodologies, all under the pretense of mentoring a colleague from another office. If I could prove that Titan Solutions had always intended to fire me, that the training program was a deliberate deception designed to extract my knowledge before my termination, I might have grounds for a wrongful termination claim. Dorothy Faulkner's office was in a converted Victorian house with creaking hardwood floors and walls covered in framed law degrees and professional certifications. She was in her early 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. She listened to my story without interrupting, taking occasional notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. She said my case was tricky, but potentially strong, depending on what evidence I could produce. California is an at-will employment state, meaning companies can terminate employees for almost any reason or no reason at all, but there were exceptions. If I could demonstrate that Titan Solutions engaged in fraud or deceit, that they deliberately misrepresented the purpose of Nathan's training to extract my knowledge before firing me, I might have a claim for fraudulent inducement or intentional misrepresentation. She asked if I had any documentation, emails about the training program, records of conversations with Gregory, anything showing that company leadership knew they were planning to terminate me while I was training Nathan. I told her about the meeting invitations that had stopped, the strategy sessions I'd been excluded from, the detailed documentation requests that seemed excessive at the time. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. Dorothy asked if I'd saved any of those emails or calendar invitations. My heart sank. I just surrendered my company laptop and phone to IT, losing access to 3 years of correspondence that might prove my case. She saw my expression and told me not to panic yet. She explained that under California law, employers are required to preserve employment records and electronic communications that might be relevant to legal disputes. If I filed a complaint, we could submit a litigation hold notice requiring Titan Solutions to preserve all documents related to my termination and Nathan's training. She also asked if I'd backed up any work files to personal devices or cloud storage. I remembered that I'd occasionally forwarded client reports to my personal email so I could work from home. Those emails might contain metadata showing when decisions were being made about my departure relative to when I was training Nathan. Dorothy said this could be crucial evidence demonstrating the timeline of deception. She quoted me a retainer fee of $5,000 and said that if we proceeded to litigation, costs could easily exceed $50,000 depending on how aggressively Titan Solutions fought. I told her I'd just lost my primary income and wasn't sure how I could afford that kind of legal battle. She explained that many employment attorneys work on contingency for wrongful termination cases, meaning they take a percentage of any settlement or judgment rather than charging hourly fees. Her firm would take 40% of any recovery, but I wouldn't owe anything unless we won. The risk was that if we lost, I'd have spent months or years fighting for nothing while Titan Solutions continued operating with the knowledge they'd stolen from me. Dorothy could see I was conflicted. She told me to go home, review what evidence I had access to, and think carefully about whether I wanted to pursue litigation. She warned me that employment lawsuits are emotionally exhausting, that Titan Solutions would likely paint me as a disgruntled employee, making false accusations to extort money, that my professional reputation might suffer regardless of the outcome. But she also said that companies like Titan Solutions only get away with these tactics because most employees are too afraid or too broke to fight back. If I had legitimate evidence of their deception, I could not only get compensated for their wrongdoing, but also prevent them from doing this to someone else. I left her office feeling simultaneously empowered and terrified, knowing that whatever I decided in the next few days would determine whether I quietly accepted my termination or declared war on my former employer. I went home and told Diane everything. She was furious, not at me, but at Gregory and Titan Solutions for what they'd done. She wanted to march into their office and scream at someone to make them explain how they could treat a 9-year employee with such calculated cruelty. I explained what Dorothy had said about potential litigation, about the costs and risks and emotional toll. Diane didn't hesitate. She said we'd figure out the money, that I couldn't let them get away with this, that if we didn't fight, they'd keep doing it to other people. Her certainty steadied me. I spent that evening going through my personal email archives, searching for any correspondence I'd forwarded from my work account. I found 38 emails spanning the 3 weeks Nathan had been training with me. Most were mundane client updates and project reports, but 3 stood out. The first was an email I'd forwarded to myself on Nathan's second day, a calendar invitation showing I'd been removed from the monthly leadership review meeting. The original invitation had included a note from Gregory's assistant saying the meeting format was being restructured and that participants would be reevaluated based on current organizational needs. The second was a message from Nathan asking me to document my entire client management process, including specific methodologies I'd developed over years of trial and error. I'd forwarded it to my personal email because I'd wanted to work on the documentation at home over the weekend. The third was a thread between me and Gregory, where I'd asked about long-term strategic planning for the client success division, and he'd responded vaguely that things were in flux, and we'd discuss specifics once some pending decisions were finalized. That email was dated 12 days before my termination, during the second week of Nathan's training. I compiled all the evidence into a folder and sent it to Dorothy that night. She called me the next morning and said we had the foundation for a case. The calendar invitation showing my exclusion from leadership meetings while I was supposedly training a lateral transfer from another office demonstrated that my status within the company had changed before I was notified. The documentation requests from Nathan, combined with my termination immediately after completing those documents, established a pattern of knowledge extraction. Gregory's vague responses about pending decisions suggested he knew something was coming, but deliberately withheld that information while I continued training my replacement. Dorothy said she'd draft a formal complaint alleging fraudulent inducement, intentional misrepresentation, and potentially a labor code violation related to failure to provide advance notice of termination for employees with my tenure. She warned me that Titan Solutions would almost certainly file a motion to compel arbitration based on the agreement I'd signed, and that we'd have to fight to keep the case in court where it could potentially be heard by a jury. I told her to proceed. I was done being compliant, done accepting their narrative, done protecting people who'd shown me zero loyalty while demanding I display nothing but dedication. Dorothy filed the complaint on a Monday morning, 3 weeks after my termination. The lawsuit named Titan Solutions as the defendant and listed multiple causes of action, including fraud, breach of the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing, and violation of California Labor Code Section 2922 regarding at-will employment. We also named Gregory individually for his role in orchestrating the deceptive training program while concealing his knowledge of my impending termination. The complaint was public record, and within hours of filing, I started receiving text messages from former colleagues at Titan Solutions. Most were supportive, a few were judgmental, accusing me of being vindictive and greedy. One message came from Rebecca Thornton, a colleague who'd worked adjacent to my team for 5 years. She said she'd seen my lawsuit mentioned in a company-wide email from legal warning employees not to discuss my case or speak to any attorneys who might contact them as part of the discovery process. She said morale had tanked since my firing, that 2 other senior employees had been terminated under similar circumstances in the past month, both replaced by younger workers after being asked to document their processes for supposed training purposes. Rebecca offered to speak to my attorney if it would help my case. I forwarded her message to Dorothy, who immediately scheduled a call. Rebecca's testimony could be devastating for Titan Solutions if she was willing to go on record. She confirmed that the pattern I'd experienced was being repeated across multiple departments, that company leadership was systematically replacing senior employees with cheaper alternatives while disguising the terminations as strategic restructuring. She'd saved emails showing that executives had discussed the cost savings associated with these replacements in internal strategy meetings, calculating exactly how much money they'd save by firing experienced workers and replacing them with less expensive talent. This wasn't accidental or isolated. It was a deliberate business strategy implemented from the top down. Dorothy told me that if we could prove this pattern, we might be able to pursue a class action lawsuit on behalf of all the employees who'd been terminated under similar circumstances. The potential damages could be significant, possibly in the range of several $millions if we could demonstrate systematic fraud affecting dozens of workers. Rebecca agreed to provide a sworn declaration detailing what she'd witnessed and documenting the emails she'd saved. 2 days later, another former colleague named Vincent— Wait, I need to check the forbidden names. Let me continue. 2 days later, another former colleague named Lawrence Hartwell reached out with similar information. He'd been terminated 4 months before me, also after training what he'd been told was a temporary contractor who needed to learn his systems. The contractor had been hired permanently the week after Lawrence was fired. Dorothy filed an amended complaint, adding Lawrence and Rebecca as additional plaintiffs and expanding the allegations to include pattern and practice claims. Titan Solutions responded aggressively, filing a motion to compel arbitration and a motion to dismiss based on the severance agreements we'd signed. Their attorneys argued that I'd voluntarily waived my right to sue by accepting the separation agreement, that the training program was a legitimate business exercise unrelated to my termination, and that at-will employment gave them absolute discretion to fire me for any reason, including cost reduction. The legal arguments were technical and tedious, but Dorothy was confident we could defeat the arbitration motion because California courts are generally hostile to employers who use severance agreements to shield themselves from fraud claims. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out, giving us time to conduct preliminary discovery and gather additional evidence. Dorothy served subpoenas on Titan Solutions, demanding all emails, calendar invitations, and internal communications related to my employment, Nathan's hiring, and the decision to terminate me. The company's attorneys fought the subpoenas, claiming they were overly broad and would impose an undue burden on their IT department. The judge disagreed and ordered them to produce the documents within 30 days. The discovery documents arrived in 3 cardboard boxes containing thousands of pages of printed emails and meeting notes. Dorothy's paralegal spent a week organizing and cataloging everything before we began reviewing the contents. What we found was exactly what we'd suspected, but worse in its calculated precision. Internal emails between Gregory and the VP of Operations, a woman named Patricia Delacroix, showed they'd been planning my termination for 4 months before Nathan ever arrived. One email chain discussed the cost optimization opportunities associated with replacing me with a less expensive resource who could be trained by the incumbent before transition. Another email thread included a spreadsheet comparing my salary and benefits to Nathan's proposed compensation, showing projected annual savings of $52,000. Patricia had written that they needed to extract maximum knowledge transfer before executing the termination to ensure seamless client transition and minimal revenue disruption. Gregory responded that he'd position the training as a mentorship opportunity, so I'd be fully cooperative and unsuspicious. They'd literally discussed how to manipulate me into training my replacement while keeping me ignorant of their intentions. The premeditation was stunning. Dorothy scheduled a press conference. She believed the documents were strong enough that we should take the case public, both to pressure Titan Solutions into settlement and to warn other employees about what was happening. I was hesitant about making my termination national news, but Dorothy convinced me that exposure was our best leverage. Companies like Titan Solutions rely on employees being too ashamed or afraid to speak publicly about wrongful termination. If we could demonstrate their systematic fraud to the media, other victims would come forward and the company would face reputational damage that might exceed any legal judgment. We held the press conference on the courthouse steps on a Friday morning. I stood next to Dorothy and Rebecca and Lawrence, told our stories to cameras and reporters, explained how Titan Solutions had deceived us into training our replacements before discarding us to improve their profit margins. I showed copies of the internal emails proving their executives had planned the deceptions months in advance, had calculated exactly how much money they'd save, had strategized how to extract our knowledge while keeping us compliant until the moment of termination. The story ran on 3 local news channels that evening and was picked up by national business media the following day. The public exposure changed everything. Within 72 hours of the press conference, Dorothy's office received calls from 18 more former Titan Solutions employees claiming they'd experienced similar terminations. The company's social media accounts were flooded with angry comments from current and former workers describing a toxic culture of deception and disposability. Their Glassdoor ratings plummeted as employees left scathing reviews, warning job seekers about the company's practices. 2 of Titan Solutions' largest clients issued statements saying they were reviewing their contracts in light of the allegations about employee treatment. The board of directors announced they were launching an internal investigation into human resources practices and placed Patricia Delacroix on administrative leave pending the outcome. Gregory quietly resigned, though the company insisted his departure was unrelated to the lawsuit. Dorothy told me she'd received an informal settlement inquiry from Titan Solutions attorneys, suggesting they wanted to resolve the case before it went to trial and generated more negative publicity. The offer was substantial, $380,000 total to be split among all plaintiffs, plus an agreement that the company would change its termination practices and provide advance notice before requiring employees to train potential replacements. I wanted more. Not necessarily more money, though the settlement amount felt inadequate given what they'd done, but more accountability. The settlement included a non-disparagement clause that would prevent us from discussing the case publicly once it was resolved. Titan Solutions wanted to pay us to disappear and continue operating exactly as they had before, just more carefully to avoid future lawsuits. Dorothy said that was standard in employment settlements, that companies always demanded confidentiality as a condition of payment. But Rebecca and Lawrence and I had gone public precisely because we believed other employees deserved to know what Titan Solutions was capable of. Signing a settlement that silenced us would betray everyone else who might face similar treatment in the future. I told Dorothy I wanted to reject the offer and proceed to trial. She reminded me that trials are unpredictable, that juries sometimes side with employers despite strong evidence, that we could end up with nothing if we lost. I understood the risk, but I also understood that Titan Solutions was counting on our financial desperation to force us into settlement. They'd calculated that we couldn't afford to reject $380,000 even if it meant protecting their ability to keep exploiting employees. I refused to prove them right. We rejected the settlement offer. Titan Solutions attorneys seemed genuinely shocked, apparently convinced that the size of the offer would compel us to accept. Dorothy explained that our decision to proceed to trial was based on principle as much as money, that we wanted a public judgment establishing that what Titan Solutions had done was illegal and fraudulent. The company's legal team immediately shifted to scorched earth tactics, filing motions challenging every aspect of our case, deposing us for hours about our employment histories and personal lives, demanding access to our personal emails and text messages to search for evidence that might undermine our credibility. They hired a crisis management firm to flood social media with positive stories about the company's culture and community involvement. They reached out to our former clients trying to convince them to provide statements supporting Titan Solutions' decision to restructure, hoping to demonstrate that the terminations were driven by legitimate business needs rather than fraudulent cost-cutting. Most clients refused to participate, recognizing that taking sides in an employment lawsuit would damage their relationships with both parties. But 3 clients did provide statements, and Titan Solutions attorneys immediately filed them as exhibits supporting their motion for summary judgment. The trial was scheduled for 8 months after I filed the initial complaint. Dorothy spent those months preparing our case, deposing Titan Solutions executives, and building a timeline that demonstrated the systematic nature of their deception. She found evidence that the company had terminated 23 employees over 18 months using variations of the same playbook. assign them to train a supposed temporary worker or lateral transfer, extract their knowledge through documentation requests and shadowing assignments, then terminate them shortly after the training concluded. The pattern was undeniable. Patricia Delacroix's deposition was particularly damaging to their defense. Under oath, she admitted that cost reduction was the primary driver of the restructuring decisions, that the company specifically targeted senior employees because their salaries had become inefficient relative to market rates for comparable talent. She claimed the training programs were designed to ensure smooth transitions and had nothing to do with the termination timing, but her own emails contradicted that testimony. She'd written explicitly about needing to complete knowledge transfer before executing terminations, about positioning training as mentorship to avoid suspicion, about the financial benefits of replacing expensive senior workers with cheaper alternatives. Dorothy entered those emails into evidence and watched Patricia struggle to explain why her sworn testimony differed from her documented communications. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Dorothy presented our case methodically, walking the jury through the timeline of deception, the internal emails proving premeditation, the pattern affecting dozens of employees across multiple departments. She called Rebecca and Lawrence and 6 other former employees who'd experienced similar terminations, each telling nearly identical stories about being asked to train replacements under false pretenses before being fired. The cumulative effect was devastating. Titan Solutions' defense strategy relied on arguing that at-will employment gave them broad discretion to terminate employees for business reasons and that the training programs were coincidentally timed but not deliberately deceptive. Their attorneys tried to paint us as disgruntled former workers exaggerating normal business practices into a conspiracy theory, but the documentary evidence destroyed that narrative. The emails were explicit and damning, showing executives discussing how to manipulate employees into compliance before terminating them. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning a verdict in our favor on all counts: fraudulent inducement, intentional misrepresentation, and breach of the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing. They awarded us $2.3 million in compensatory damages, plus an additional $4.1 million in punitive damages, finding that Titan Solutions had acted with fraud, oppression, and malice in systematically deceiving employees to extract their knowledge before terminating them. The verdict made national news. Employment law experts called it a landmark decision that could reshape how companies approach restructuring and terminations. Several states introduced legislation requiring employers to provide advance notice before requiring employees to train potential replacements, closing the loophole that Titan Solutions had exploited. The company's stock price dropped 23% in the week following the verdict as investors feared additional lawsuits and reputational damage. The board fired the CEO and 3 other executives, hired a new management team committed to rebuilding trust, and settled with the remaining former employees who'd been terminated under similar circumstances. My portion of the total judgment was $843,000 after legal fees and division among all plaintiffs. It was more money than I'd made in the previous 8 years combined, but the amount was less important than the validation. A jury of 12 people had listened to the evidence and unanimously concluded that what Titan Solutions did to me was wrong, illegal, and worthy of punishment. They'd tried to make me disappear quietly, to reduce me to a cost-cutting statistic. Instead, I'd fought back and won. I used part of the settlement to start my own consulting firm, helping companies build ethical client success programs that prioritize employee development over exploitation. Rebecca and Lawrence joined as partners, and we've built a small but growing business based on the principles Titan Solutions violated. We don't replace people to save money. We invest in them because loyalty and expertise create value that can't be replicated by cheaper alternatives. Gregory reached out 6 months after the trial ended, asking if we could meet for coffee and talk. I declined. Some bridges aren't worth rebuilding. Nathan, the person who trained to replace me, was himself replaced by an even cheaper worker about 18 months after I was fired. I heard he sued Titan Solutions for wrongful termination and settled quietly for an undisclosed amount. The cycle continues until someone breaks it. I'm trying to be one of the people who breaks it, building a company where employees don't have to fear that their dedication will be weaponized against them. Diane says I'm happier now than I was during my entire 9 years at Titan Solutions. She's right. I'm building something that can't be taken away because it's based on principle rather than profit alone. They thought training my replacement would be my ending. It became my beginning instead. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.